You kneel before God with a heavy heart, your lips move in familiar words, your hands fold in the ancient gesture of supplication. But something feels terribly wrong. The ceiling seems to have grown thicker, your words echo back empty, and that sacred connection you once felt has dissolved into a hollow routine. You're not alone in this spiritual desert. Millions of souls across the world are discovering that their prayers, though sincere, seem to bounce off heaven's gates like stones against an iron wall. What you're experiencing isn't a crisis of faith, but something far more subtle and dangerous. You've fallen into spiritual traps that even the most devout believers stumble into unknowingly. Saint Teresa of Ávila, the great doctor of the Church and master of interior prayer, spent decades mapping the treacherous terrain of the soul's journey toward God. Through her own seasons of dryness, doubt, and spiritual warfare, she discovered that most prayers fail not because God isn't listening, but because we've unknowingly built barriers between our hearts and heaven. In her profound work, The Interior Castle, she warned that many souls who believe they are praying deeply are actually trapped in the outer courtyards of their own spiritual house, never reaching the inner chambers where God dwells and responds. These aren't failures of devotion, they're errors of method, invisible mistakes that transform what should be intimate conversation with the divine into empty religious performance. The tragedy isn't that you've stopped believing, it's that you're praying in ways that prevent your faith from reaching its full power. Teresa knew this pain intimately. For nearly 20 years, she struggled through what she called the prayer of quiet, interrupted by constant distractions, dryness that felt like spiritual death, and the crushing sensation that her words were dissolving into nothingness before they could reach God's ears. But her breakthrough came not when she prayed harder, but when she learned to pray differently. She discovered that most spiritual dryness isn't a sign of God's absence. It's evidence of specific correctable errors in how we approach the sacred act of prayer. Tonight, you're going to discover the 7 deadly errors that St. Teresa identified as prayer killers, the subtle mistakes that transform powerful communion with God into frustrating religious exercise. But more importantly, you're going to learn her precise corrections, the same spiritual techniques that lifted her from years of prayer stagnation to become one of history's greatest mystics. Are you ready to stop wondering why your prayers feel empty and start experiencing the deep, transformative conversation with God that your soul desperately craves? Subscribe now to receive more of St. Teresa's profound wisdom, because what you're about to learn could change not just how you pray, but how deeply God responds to your heart's cry. You wake up late again, anxiety already clawing at your chest as you mentally rehearse the day's overwhelming demands. Coffee brewing, phone buzzing with notifications, mind racing through your endless to-do list. And somewhere in this chaos, you remember you should pray. So you squeeze in a hurried, "Our Father," rattle off a quick list of requests, and rush toward the door feeling vaguely guilty but telling yourself that at least you remembered God today. But St. Teresa would stop you right there with a gentle but firm warning. This isn't prayer, it's spiritual fast food, and it's slowly starving your soul to death. In her letters to the Carmelite sisters under her guidance, Teresa wrote with unusual directness about this first and most common prayer killer. A soul that approaches God in haste approaches not God at all, but an idol of her own anxiety. She understood that rushed prayer isn't just ineffective, it's actually counterproductive, training your spirit to associate communion with the divine with stress, obligation, and superficiality. When you pray with one eye on the clock and your mind already 3 tasks ahead, you're teaching your soul that God is just another item to check off your spiritual checklist, rather than the infinite wellspring of peace who longs to slow your racing heart and restore your scattered thoughts. The devastating irony is that rushed prayer actually creates more anxiety, not less. When you approach God like a frantic customer placing an urgent order at a cosmic drive-thru, you miss the very thing your overwhelmed spirit needs most. The deep settling peace that comes from resting in the presence of the one who holds your entire life in his loving hands. Teresa discovered that just 5 minutes of truly present, unhurried prayer could accomplish more spiritual work than hours of distracted religious activity. She learned that God doesn't respond to the volume of your words or the speed of your requests. He responds to the quality of your attention and the depth of your trust. This is why Teresa's first correction is so radical in its simplicity. Create sacred space, not sacred time. Before you speak even a single word to God, give yourself the gift of 3 deep, conscious breaths. Feel your body settle, let your mind's chatter fade to background noise. And remember this eternal truth: the God you're about to address isn't checking his watch. He's been waiting for this moment of genuine connection all day, ready to pour his peace into your rushed and worried heart. When you slow down enough to actually meet God in prayer rather than talking at him through prayer, you discover that those few minutes of true presence can transform your entire day. Are you ready to stop rushing through prayer and start dwelling with the one who has infinite time for your heart? You settle into prayer with the best intentions, folding your hands and closing your eyes, ready for deep communion with God. But within 30 seconds, your mind has already wandered to tomorrow's meeting, the argument you had yesterday, the bills piling up on your kitchen counter, and what you're going to make for dinner. You catch yourself drifting and try to refocus, only to discover 5 minutes later that you've been mentally reorganizing your closet while your lips moved through familiar prayers your heart never heard. Sound familiar? You're experiencing what St. Teresa called the monkey of the mind, and she had surprising wisdom about why this happens and what to do about it. Most Christians assume that mental wandering during prayer is a sign of spiritual weakness or lack of devotion. But Teresa understood something revolutionary. Distractions aren't the problem. Accepting them as normal is the problem. In The Way of Perfection, she wrote, "The mind that jumps from thought to thought during prayer is like a bird that cannot find a branch strong enough to hold it. The solution isn't to chase the bird, but to become the sturdy branch." She realized that trying to force concentration through willpower alone actually increases mental agitation, creating a frustrating cycle where the harder you try to focus, the more scattered your thoughts become. Teresa's approach was radically different from the harsh self-discipline many spiritual teachers recommend. Instead of fighting distraction with force, she taught her nuns to gently redirect their attention with what she called loving vigilance. When you notice your mind wandering, don't scold yourself or feel guilty. Simply and kindly return your attention to God, like a mother gently guiding a curious child back to the path. She discovered that this gentle correction, repeated with patience and self-compassion, gradually trains the mind to find rest in God's presence rather than constantly seeking stimulation and activity. The key insight Teresa offers is this: your wandering mind isn't a spiritual failure. It's evidence that you're human. But becoming a person of deep prayer means learning to create an inner sanctuary where your thoughts can settle and your heart can truly encounter the divine. Before each prayer session, spend 1 full minute in complete silence, not trying to think about anything spiritual, just letting your mental chatter slow down naturally. Then, when you begin to pray, keep one simple phrase as your anchor: "Here I am, Lord. Here you are with me." Every time your mind wanders, gently return to this truth. If this wisdom is resonating with your experience, take a moment to subscribe to this channel for more of St. Teresa's transformative teachings and write in the comments, "St. Teresa, teach me to quiet my restless mind." Your witness might be exactly what another struggling soul needs to hear today. Picture yourself having coffee with your dearest friend. But instead of conversation, you spend the entire hour talking nonstop about your problems, your needs, your concerns, and your requests for help. Never once pausing to listen, never asking how they're doing, never creating space for them to share their heart with you. You'd recognize immediately that this isn't friendship. It's self-centered need dumping disguised as relationship. Yet this is exactly how most people approach prayer: an endless monologue of petitions, complaints, and demands directed at God, with no silence, no listening, no space for the divine to respond. St. Teresa called this the prayer of the marketplace: loud, busy, one-sided, and ultimately hollow. In her mystical autobiography, Teresa described the years she spent trapped in this pattern. "I would come before our Lord with my long list of needs and desires, speaking to him as if he were a merchant and I a customer with urgent business to conduct. Only later did I realize that true prayer begins not when I start talking to God, but when I stop talking long enough for God to speak to me." She discovered that the most powerful prayers aren't those filled with the most words, but those punctuated by the deepest silences, spaces where the infinite love of God can actually reach and transform the human heart. The devastating consequence of monologue prayer is that it keeps you trapped in your own limited perspective, your own small understanding of what you need and how God should respond. When you only speak and never listen, you miss the gentle whispers of divine guidance, the subtle shifts in your heart that indicate God's response, and the profound peace that comes from simply resting in the presence of unlimited love. Teresa learned that God often answers prayers not with external changes, but with internal transformations that can only be received in silence. The breakthrough insight, the sudden peace about a difficult situation, the unexpected clarity about a decision. These gifts come not when you're talking, but when you're truly present and receptive. Teresa's correction for this error is both simple and revolutionary. Transform every petition into a conversation. After each request, each concern, each cry of your heart, pause and ask, "Lord, what do you want me to know about this?" Then wait, not with anxiety or impatience, but with the quiet expectancy of someone who knows they are deeply loved and that love is preparing to respond. Create space in your prayer for God to surprise you, to offer perspectives you hadn't considered, to flood your heart with peace that surpasses understanding. Remember, prayer isn't a religious performance where you do all the work. It's an intimate dialogue where you speak your truth and then trust enough to let God speak His. When you learn to listen as deeply as you petition, your prayer life transforms from spiritual monologue into life-changing conversation with the divine. You kneel in prayer and pour out your heart to God, asking for healing, for provision, for guidance, for intervention in an impossible situation. Your words are sincere, your need is real, your faith feels genuine. But lurking beneath the surface, like a hidden undertow threatening to pull you down, whispers a small, persistent voice. Will God really answer? Does He actually care about my specific situation? Am I worthy of His attention? You push these doubts aside and continue praying, not realizing that this secret skepticism is creating an invisible barrier between your heart and heaven's response. Saint Teresa understood this spiritual dynamic with laser precision. Doubt doesn't just weaken prayer, it actively cancels prayer's power. In her profound work, The Interior Castle, Teresa wrote with startling honesty about her own battles with doubt. There were seasons when I brought my petitions before our Lord, with one hand extended in supplication and the other hand secretly building walls of disbelief around my heart. I did not understand then that God cannot pour His grace through a vessel that is simultaneously opening and closing itself to His love. She discovered that doubt in prayer isn't just a lack of confidence. It's a form of spiritual double-mindedness that creates chaos in the realm where miracles are born. The tragedy of prayer mixed with doubt is that it puts you in the exhausting position of asking for something while simultaneously preparing for disappointment. This internal contradiction doesn't just make prayer ineffective, it actually reinforces the very despair and helplessness you're praying to escape. When you approach God with one foot in faith and one foot in skepticism, you're teaching your soul that divine intervention is unlikely, that your situation is probably hopeless, and that God's love might not extend to your particular crisis. This spiritual schizophrenia keeps you trapped in cycles of desperate prayer, followed by resigned disappointment. Teresa's solution is both challenging and liberating. Before you present any request to God, you must first present your doubts to God. She learned to pray with radical honesty. Lord, I'm asking for this miracle, but I'm also afraid you won't answer. I want to trust you completely, but part of me is terrified of being disappointed again. Help my unbelief become belief. This vulnerable transparency doesn't weaken your prayer. It purifies it, removing the hidden contradictions that block divine response. When you acknowledge your doubts instead of hiding them, God can heal your skepticism along with your circumstances. The most powerful prayer isn't the one free from all doubt, but the one honest enough to bring even doubt to the feet of divine love. Are you ready to stop pretending your faith is stronger than it is and start letting God strengthen the faith you actually have? Every morning at 7 a.m., you recite the same prayers in the same order, your mouth forming familiar words while your mind operates on spiritual autopilot. The rosary beads slide through your fingers with mechanical precision, decades of repetition having worn smooth grooves in both the prayer and your attention. You feel virtuous about your consistency, proud of your discipline, but somewhere deep in your spirit, you sense that something vital has died in this religious routine. Your prayers have become like an old song played so many times that you no longer hear the melody. Technically correct, but emotionally dead. Saint Teresa watched this spiritual tragedy unfold in countless devoted souls, and she had a shocking diagnosis. Routine prayer isn't just ineffective, it's spiritually dangerous. In her letters to fellow Carmelites, Teresa wrote with unusual urgency about what she called the death of prayer through repetition. I have seen souls who pray the office with the devotion of parrots and wonder why their hearts remain cold and their lives unchanged. They mistake religious consistency for spiritual progress, not understanding that God is not impressed by our ability to repeat words, but by our capacity to offer genuine love. She realized that when prayer becomes mere habit, it stops being communication with the divine and becomes a substitute for real relationship. A spiritual security blanket that actually prevents the vulnerability and spontaneity that true intimacy with God requires. The insidious danger of routine prayer is that it creates the illusion of spiritual progress while actually fostering spiritual stagnation. When you can pray perfectly without thinking, without feeling, without being present, you've transformed the most sacred act of human existence into religious muscle memory. Your soul begins to confuse familiarity with intimacy, repetition with devotion, and consistency with depth. Meanwhile, the living God who longs for fresh encounters with your heart finds himself addressing a spiritual recording rather than a living, breathing, responsive human being. Teresa observed that souls trapped in prayer routine often become spiritually proud, judging others who pray less regularly while remaining blind to their own emotional and spiritual emptiness. Teresa's radical correction requires both courage and humility. She challenges you to periodically abandon your familiar prayers and approach God with nothing but your raw, unscripted heart. Put aside your practiced words, she urged, and speak to our Lord as you would speak to a friend who knows all your secrets and loves you anyway. Try praying for an entire week without using any memorized prayers, formal structures, or religious formulas. Instead, sit in God's presence and simply share what's actually happening in your life. Your real feelings, your genuine fears and hopes. This isn't disrespecting traditional prayer. It's breaking through the spiritual calluses that routine can create around your heart. When you rediscover the art of spontaneous, authentic conversation with God, your formal prayers will come alive again with fresh meaning and genuine emotion. You approach God in prayer carrying invisible weight. The harsh words you spoke in anger yesterday, the small lie you told to avoid consequences, the way you deliberately ignored someone in need, the compromise you made that violated your own conscience. But instead of acknowledging these spiritual wounds, you skip straight to your requests, hoping God won't notice the unconfessed sins, creating static between your soul and heaven. You may not even be conscious of this pattern, but Saint Teresa understood a devastating truth. An unrepentant heart doesn't just limit prayer's effectiveness, it actively corrupts the spiritual atmosphere in which prayer occurs. She knew that approaching God with hidden sin is like trying to have an intimate conversation while wearing a mask. In her spiritual autobiography, Teresa wrote with painful honesty about the years she spent praying while carrying secret guilt. I would kneel before our Lord with great devotion, yet I carried within my heart actions and attitudes that I dared not bring into His light. I wondered why my prayers felt heavy, why His presence seemed distant, not understanding that I had built walls of shame between my soul and His mercy. She discovered that unconfessed sin doesn't just displease God, it actually prevents you from receiving the very forgiveness and transformation that prayer is meant to provide. The soul carrying hidden guilt approaches God as a defendant rather than a beloved child, defensive rather than open, fearful rather than trusting. The tragic irony is that the sins you're most afraid to confess are often the very barriers that make your prayers feel powerless and empty. When you hide your failures from God, as if omniscience could be fooled, you create a split in your spiritual consciousness, part of you reaching toward divine love, while another part recoils in shame. This internal contradiction makes authentic prayer impossible because you can't simultaneously hide from God and connect with God. Teresa observed that souls trapped in this pattern often compensate by praying longer, louder, or with more religious intensity, trying to earn God's attention while secretly believing they don't deserve it. Teresa's solution is as beautiful as it is simple. Begin every prayer with what she called the prayer of truth. Before asking God for anything, honestly acknowledge the ways you've fallen short since your last conversation with Him. Don't minimize, don't rationalize, don't compare yourself to others. Just truthfully present your failures to the one who already knows them and is waiting to heal them. "My Lord," Teresa would pray, "before I ask you for anything, I want to acknowledge the ways I've failed to love you and others since we last spoke." This isn't self-flagellation, it's spiritual hygiene, clearing the channels through which grace flows. When you stop hiding your humanity from God, you discover that His love for you isn't diminished by your failures. It's actually most powerfully expressed in His eagerness to forgive them. The prayer that begins with honest repentance ends with transformed hearts and answered petitions. You've been praying about the same situation for months, maybe years. You've asked, pleaded, bargained, and begged, but nothing has changed. The diagnosis remains the same, the relationship is still broken, the financial pressure continues to mount, and slowly, insidiously, a terrible thought begins to take root in your heart. Maybe prayer doesn't really work. Maybe I'm just talking to myself. Maybe God doesn't actually intervene in human affairs the way I thought He did. You continue going through the motions of prayer because you don't know what else to do, but your words feel hollow, your faith feels fractured, and your heart has quietly given up expecting any real response from heaven. Saint Teresa called this the most dangerous prayer killer of all, praying without hope, asking without really believing that asking makes any difference. In The Way of Perfection, Teresa wrote about her own dark nights of spiritual doubt with brutal honesty. "There were seasons when I brought my petitions before God like a beggar who had lost all expectation of receiving alms, going through the familiar motions while my heart whispered that divine intervention was a beautiful myth for simpler souls than mine." She understood that hopeless prayer isn't just ineffective, it's spiritually toxic, slowly poisoning your relationship with God and transforming what should be an act of faith into an exercise in religious futility. When you pray without genuinely believing that prayer can change anything, you're not exercising faith, you're rehearsing despair. The devastating cycle of hopeless prayer is that it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. When you approach God expecting nothing, you position your heart to receive nothing, not because God isn't responding, but because despair has made you spiritually deaf to His responses. Teresa realized that God often answers hopeless prayers in ways that the hopeless heart cannot recognize, through changed perspectives, unexpected peace, new opportunities, or shifts in circumstances that the despairing soul dismisses as coincidence. Meanwhile, the cycle deepens. Unanswered prayers, that may actually be answered in unrecognized ways, fuel more despair, which creates more hopeless prayer, which makes divine response even harder to perceive. Teresa's breakthrough came when she learned to separate hope from understanding. "I realized that I had been demanding not just that God answer my prayers, but that He answer them in ways I could immediately recognize and appreciate. True hope," I discovered, means trusting that God is working even when I cannot see how, even when His response looks nothing like what I expected. Her correction for hopeless prayer is radical. Instead of praying for specific outcomes, begin praying for the grace to recognize God's responses in whatever form they take. Pray for spiritual eyes to see divine movement in your circumstances, divine love in your relationships, and divine purpose in your struggles. When you stop demanding that God prove Himself through visible miracles and start trusting that He's always working in invisible ways, your hope returns. Not because your circumstances change, but because your capacity to perceive God's presence in every circumstance is restored. Now you understand why your prayers have felt empty, why heaven has seemed silent, why the deep connection with God you once knew has faded into religious routine. But understanding the problem is only the beginning. Saint Teresa didn't just diagnose the 7 deadly errors that silence prayer, she mapped the precise path back to vibrant, transformative communion with the divine. The journey from broken prayer to living prayer isn't about perfecting technique or following complex formulas. It's about allowing God to heal the subtle wounds in your spiritual approach that you never even knew existed. Teresa's transformation path is both simple enough for a child to follow and profound enough to occupy a lifetime of spiritual growth. The first step on Teresa's path requires what she called holy dissatisfaction, a willingness to acknowledge that your current prayer life isn't working, and that continuing to pray the same way will continue to produce the same empty results. This isn't self-condemnation, it's spiritual honesty. The recognition that mechanical prayer, rushed prayer, doubtful prayer, and hopeless prayer have robbed you of the intimate relationship with God that your soul desperately craves. Teresa knew that transformation begins not with trying harder, but with admitting that your current approach needs divine intervention. Lord, she would pray, I have been praying, but I have not been connecting. I have been speaking, but I have not been communing. Teach me to pray as you want to be approached. The second movement in Teresa's transformation involves what she called the Great Simplification, stripping away all the religious complexity that has accumulated around your prayer life and returning to the pure essence of heart speaking to heart. For 1 month, she recommends, pray using only 3 elements: presence, sitting quietly in God's company; honesty, sharing what's actually happening in your life; and listening, creating space for God to respond. No formal prayers, no complex structures, no spiritual performances, just you and God in the kind of simple, authentic relationship that makes transformation possible. This isn't permanent. It's spiritual rehabilitation, allowing your prayer muscles to heal from the strain of trying too hard. The final element of Teresa's path is what she called patience with the process. Understanding that the movement from dead prayer to living prayer happens gradually, often invisibly, through seasons of dryness as well as seasons of consolation. She warned against measuring prayer's effectiveness by emotional satisfaction or immediate results, teaching instead that the most powerful prayer often feels the most ordinary. The soul that perseveres in simple, honest, hopeful communication with God, Teresa wrote, is being transformed even when it feels nothing, sees nothing, and understands nothing of what God is accomplishing in the hidden depths of the heart. Your job isn't to manufacture spiritual experiences. It's to show up consistently, honestly, and expectantly, trusting that the same God who created you knows exactly how to restore the prayer life He designed you to enjoy. 6 months after beginning to apply St. Teresa's corrections, something has shifted in the deepest chambers of your heart. You no longer approach prayer as a duty to be fulfilled or a problem to be solved, but as a sanctuary to be entered, a conversation to be savored, a relationship to be deepened. The silence that once felt empty now pulses with presence. The words that once felt hollow now carry weight and meaning. The time that once dragged now passes too quickly. You've discovered what Teresa called the prayer of the heart. Not perfect prayer, not prayer without struggle, but prayer that has become genuinely alive with divine love and human authenticity. This is what happens when the 7 deadly errors are replaced by 7 life-giving graces, where once you rush through prayer, you now create sacred space, approaching God with the unhurried reverence you would bring to the most important conversation of your day. Your wandering mind has learned to rest in God's presence, gently returning to divine focus without self-condemnation when thoughts drift. The monologue has become genuine dialogue, with space for listening woven throughout your speaking, creating room for God's voice to reach your receptive heart. Doubt hasn't disappeared, but it has been transformed into honest questions that you bring directly to God, rather than hidden skepticism that undermines your faith. The prison of routine has become the freedom of spontaneous love, where formal prayers and informal conversations flow naturally together in the rhythm of relationship. The heart that once approached God, carrying hidden guilt, now comes clean and open, having learned that confession isn't the price of admission to God's presence, but the pathway to deeper intimacy with divine mercy. Most remarkably, hopeless prayer has been replaced by a hope that doesn't depend on getting what you want, but on trusting that what you receive from God is exactly what your soul needs for its eternal flourishing. You've learned to recognize divine responses in unexpected forms, peace that surpasses understanding, wisdom that transcends your natural insight, strength that appears in moments of weakness, and love that flows through you toward others in ways that surprise even yourself. This transformation isn't the end of your prayer journey. It's the beginning of a lifetime of deepening communion with the God who has been waiting for authentic relationship with you since the moment you first drew breath. Saint Teresa spent 40 years after her initial breakthrough continuing to discover new depths of prayer, new ways of loving God, new dimensions of spiritual intimacy that she never could have imagined during her years of struggle. The living prayer you've learned to practice will continue evolving, growing, and surprising you with fresh encounters with divine love. But you'll never again have to wonder whether prayer works or whether God is listening, because you've learned the secret that Teresa discovered in her little cell in Ávila. When the human heart learns to approach the divine heart with presence, honesty, faith, and hope, heaven and earth meet in conversation that transforms everything it touches. Are you ready to spend the rest of your life discovering just